This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations World War III, a real-time strategy game for PC and mobile devices. But more on that in just a few minutes.
Do you hear me? I'm not afraid anymore!
The 2020 presidential election was accompanied by perhaps an unprecedented environment of fear. Occurring after nearly a year of lockdowns and a prevailing concern with the health of the nation as it faces a novel virus surely produced a culture afraid of contact. That alone would situate the election within a unique aura of ongoing fear. This, of course, was not the only thing that might have frightened people during the election cycle, as it occurred at the tail end of months of prolonged riots and civil unrest in cities across the country, which surely induced fear in business owners and homeowners alike, concerned about the security of their property or even their lives. In and of itself, the civil unrest was in large a response to feelings of fear towards the police, given that a reminder of brutality was the impetus behind those events. Finally, there is the fear that the elections themselves always instill in at least a portion of a population, worried about the future of the nation and the world, but particularly so when that election concerns Donald J. Trump, a man even otherwise apolitical people have heard via the media for years is an authoritarian dictator who puts children in cages, thinks white supremacists are very fine people, colluded with the Russians to steal the 2016 election, and so on.
All these comparisons to Trump, it's like, it bums me out.
Trump terror was not just relegated to the major news headlines. It seeped into seemingly every article, every day, so much that it seemingly saved the otherwise dying media establishment, who have spent the last 4 years enjoying the Trump bump while instilling a terrible fear about the commander-in-chief in the hearts and minds of their readers. Just for example, in October of 2019, the New York Times claimed that Trump had privately, quote, often talked about fortifying a border wall with water-filled trenches stocked with snakes or alligators, and that he, quote, wanted the wall electrified with spikes on top that could pierce human flesh.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
After 4 years of headlines like that, and nearly a year of protest after protest and riot after riot, all coinciding with a massive public health crisis, would it really surprise anyone here to suggest that a lot of Americans are currently afraid? Given the environment of fear which has encompassed the political zeitgeist in addition to the media framing, particularly in the context of the 2020 coup, the ongoing civil unrest in the United States, the fear that half of the country are baddies who need to be put on lists and dealt with by truth and reconciliation committees, and of course that Trump is literal Adolf Hitler, who by the way is a newly elected Nambian politician, and in contrast on the right, the fear that Joe Biden is, well, Joe Biden.
I got hairy legs that turn blonde in the sun.
I guess if you don't like the wars he starts and the taxes he raises, at least you can take solace in the knowledge that he'll develop some disease and hand the keys over to Kamala Harris if things get too spicy. Yeah, those prospects might scare a few people. In fact, they might scare most people. How does fear influence political action? And was the environment of fear in which the 2020 election occurred such an important factor that it not only brought voters out in record numbers, but convinced more people to vote for Joe Biden than Barack Obama? Given the fearful nature of 2020, did fear affect the election, and was that fear enough to bring out these unprecedented numbers of voters? To understand, let's look at the effects of terror management on political action. But before we get into it, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, which I couldn't think of a better video in which to plug it, and that's Conflict of Nations World War III. Conflict of Nations is a free-to-play strategy game that you can play in your browser, on Steam, or on your Android or iOS devices. This is a modern global warfare game with battles that are waged in real time between up to 100 players all at once. Just as real conflict isn't won in a day, neither is it in Conflict of Nations, where a match doesn't take minutes or hours but days or even weeks. Choose an available nation and start the game. For obvious reasons, I chose Finland, and was immediately set upon by infamous warmongers, Karelia. Tell your units what to do, and set about building new ones and gathering resources to fuel your war machine. But don't worry about watching the screen with bated breath, because your units do move in real time. One thing I like about Conflict of Nations is that you can check into the game for just a few minutes once or twice a day to update your research production and troop orders. Boom, just like that, I made pies out of the Karelians. But don't rest upon your laurels, because the game does keep moving with or without you. Which is why, after I didn't log in for a few days, I found myself completely dominated by Poland. What a twist. This is a game of careful strategy, planning, and building, but not one that requires an enormous time investment all at once. It's easy to just open up the app for a few minutes, put in a few orders, and go about your day. Or if you're more interested in fast-paced gameplay, there are 3 and 4 times speed modes that you can try out so that you don't have to wait so long. The real world is crazy enough as it is, so why not pretend that the world is at war and go bully Karelia in Conflict of Nations? Click the link in my description to check out Conflict of Nations for yourself and meet me one-on-one in the battlefield. Thanks Conflict of Nations for sponsoring this video. I really couldn't think of a better sponsor for a video about how fear influences politics than a real-time World War III strategy game. And speaking of fear, let's get into the research on terror management and political action. I don't know about you, but fear is certainly a word that I'd use to describe the overall emotional state of 2020. From a pandemic to widespread social unrest, and now the safety of the US election, there are plenty of things this year that have made people feel afraid. So let's examine the effects of fear in relationship to politics and behavior, specifically voting behavior. Terror management theory, or TMT, and not TNT, which is not dynamite by the way, is nowhere near as scary as it sounds, and instead provides another theoretical framework from which we can understand how fears, particularly fears that arise when our ideological worldview is called into question, create a sense of anxiety and existential dread. Almost any worldview, be it social, economic, or political, when threatened, can produce this anxiety via terror management. Worldviews also serve as a buffer against something called mortality salience, which is really just the fancy social science term for a memento mori, a reminder of one's own mortality and inevitable death. That is, believing in a system larger than the self actually produces fear of death. In other words, when we are afraid, we rely upon our ideological positions as a source of emotional support, and thus when we are afraid, we also tend to be more partisan, or maybe even just a bit more political in general. An early experiment of terror management looking specifically at the concept of mortality salience from Rosenblatt et al. 1989 examined how judges and judiciary leniency were affected by fear. Half of this sample of municipal court judges in Tucson, Arizona filled out a questionnaire about death. Then all of the judges read a case brief about a woman accused of prostitution and were asked to set a bail for her. Judges who were not reminded of their mortality set an average bail of $50, while in contrast, judges who were first reminded of their mortality set an average bail of $455, 9 times as much. This classic experiment illustrates how mortality salience can make us more partisan, or at least judge others more harshly, and that can include how one judges political concerns or opinions. For example, in a first experiment from Arndt, Greenberg, and Cook 2003, they primed thoughts of death by asking participants to briefly describe the emotions that thinking about death arouses in them, or ask them to think about dental pain, the control, and were then asked to complete a series of unfinished words. We might expect people who have been primed to think about death would be more likely to fill in the blanks with words related to nationalism. For example, someone whose mortality is primed is more likely to complete a word starting with the letters S-E-N as senator rather than senile, although perhaps both could be indicative of political activation in the current year.
I'll lead an effective strategy to mobilize true international effort to pressure.
They found that only male participants were more likely to complete the word puzzle with nationalistic words when they were primed about thoughts of death. In a fourth experiment in this set, which looked exclusively at men, no, not like that, well, maybe, who am I to judge, Dr. Arndt? the true subliminal nature of the relationship between worldview, in this case nationalism, and fear of death was illustrated by quickly showing participants 3 words on the computer screen and tasking them with determining whether or not the first and third word were thematically related, with the second word either being related to death or related to pain. For example, romantic orientation, which was also assessed here, would relate the words love and marriage, while nationalistic orientation would relate the words state and law. When participants saw words related to death in between the 2 related or unrelated terms, they were more likely to recognize connections between nationalistic words, but not romantic words. In a 5th study utilizing the subliminal method, they found again that women's nationalism was unaffected by death primes, but that death primes also decreased the accessibility of the connection that they formed between romantic words. So women were certainly affected here, but it's likely that women's salient worldviews are more commonly relationship-oriented rather than politically oriented. Further, and once again, context matters here, in that in a 7th experiment, and yes, there's a reason that I'm skipping around and not talking about every single one because clearly there's a lot of them, participants were asked to think about death or about dental pain, and then either asked to think about what it means to be an American, which, I mean, duh, we all know what that means, or think about eating food. But that's where you screw it up, aren't Greenberg and Cook, because they're the same thing. Point is, participants were most likely to find nationalistic words in a word search puzzle when their mortality was salient and they thought about being an American. The full model, seen here, illustrates how this process works, in that when people think about death, they are also primed to think about their political worldview, and through their worldview, develop a psychological defense against the fear invoked by the big sleep. People who are worried about death may also be more adversarial and even violent towards their political opponents, as the cultural environment of 2020 and the civil unrest which has plagued cities across the country has illustrated, but also as can be seen in data from McGregor et al. 1998 in the first of 4 experiments. In this test, self-described liberals and conservatives were given a prime to either think about death or think about taking an exam, and then read an essay that threatened their political worldviews. For example, the segment that threatened liberal worldviews reads as follows.
Don't even get me started. Liberals are the cause of so many problems in this country, it's not funny. Not only that, but they get in the way of decent Americans who are trying to solve all those problems that they created in the first place. The bleeding heart stance they take of trying to help everyone is a joke and incredibly stupid. How can they help the world when they can't even help themselves? Do liberals put any thought into what they believe? I don't think so. If they did, they would realize that they are ruining the country. Thankfully, there are people in power that agree with me, who can and will control the whiny liberals and put them in their place. The best place for liberals is out of my sight. They make me sick.
There was no real reason to read the entire stimuli out, other than because it made me chuckle. But the anti-conservative message was nearly identical, with just a few words altered. The message supposedly was written by another participant within the experiment, and after reading the segment that challenged their worldview, participants were asked to complete a different study about spicy food preference. I hope you guys can see where this is going.
Spicy meat. Yeah, boy.
They were asked about their own personal preference for hot sauce, and were then told that the person who had written that piece that attacked their personal worldview would be given a saltine spiced with hot sauce to the degree and amount of their choice, and were also told that this person generally really did not like hot sauce, but would be forced to consume the entire cracker either way. This means the person who just read about how stupid and vile their political ideology was could choose to give a very spicy saltine to the person who had written that statement, knowing said person disliked spice. Participants whose political worldviews were threatened both reported adding more hot sauce to the cracker, and actually did in terms of weight, both describing putting twice as much sauce and actually putting twice as much sauce onto the cracker than those whose politics had not been challenged, specifically when those participants had thought about death beforehand. In the control condition where participants thought about exams and not about death, they also put more hot sauce on the cracker when their worldview was threatened, but in contrast, reported adding less than those whose worldview was challenged, and actually did in terms of total volume of hot sauce. A second study replicated the first, but also had participants describe the opinions they held towards their spicy recipients either before or after unloading liquid death upon the saltine. Those who were primed to think about death and asked to evaluate the person who wrote the political worldview-threatening excerpt first piled much more hot sauce onto the cracker than those who added the sauce after reporting their feelings about the other participant. Subjects added more hot sauce than they reported that they had, regardless of the prime or when they described their feelings, but added the most when they were given a chance to vocalize their dislike of the other participant right before adding the hot sauce. These data indicate that rage against people who insult our political worldview is actually not totally subconscious, and instead only becomes more pronounced when ruminated upon cognitively and recently. Thus, the more recently someone is reminded to think about someone who they perceive of as their political enemy, the more aggressive they will be towards that oppositional target. I love this study for how just incredibly extra it is.
Shall we have a go at curing cancer? No. I'm gonna see how many fruit pastels it takes to choke a kestrel.
But I think it also illustrates a fairly important point for 2020 politics. The implication of these findings is that insulting someone's political ideology makes that person vindictive and aggressive. Arguably, this could apply to a Twitter warning label which stifles free speech, but certainly applies to the portion of the country calling for Trump supporters' names to be kept on a list for Truth and Reconciliation Councils, as have been proposed by affiliates and indirectly by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Trump Accountability Project, which aims to keep a list of the names and addresses of Trump supporters who publicly advocated for the president or donated more than $1,000 to his campaign. But they're not alone. Writer for The New Republic, Bruce Bartlett, made it even more clear, saying that all people involved in the Trump administration, as well as, that's right, everyday donors to his campaign, should be barred from employment forever, imprisoned, and become social outcasts. This is not a fringe opinion anymore, it's clearly an increasingly popular one. And I'm not saying all this to freak anyone out or to activate terror management effects in you guys, but the data are indicative that when people feel their political ideology is threatened, and they are given an opportunity for retaliation, yeah, it seems that they will likely take it, whether that be hot sauce administration or gulag admission. Not a threat, just a sad prediction. It's important to note that thinking about the mortality of others also seems to increase partisanship, of which data from Chattard, Arndt, and Brzezinski 2010 were illustrative. Twist participants were polled twice, once in 1999 and a second time in 2006, and asked about their political orientations as well as their stances on various political topics. They were also asked if any close friends or relatives had died at any point during the 7-year period of longitudinal assessment. They found that loss of a loved one increased political dogmatism both within liberals and conservatives, with conservatives becoming less accepting of spending for social issues, while liberals became more willing to support environmental protection initiatives. In toto, while loss increased partisanship in both groups, it was significantly only associated with increased political conservatism. Thus, I suppose in the cases of the coup or the 2020 political unrest, it really does depend on if you know people who were personally affected. Personal connections may move people further right, while mortality salience in general, at a societal level, may move people left. But we'll look more into that going forward. Let's quickly take a step back from individual studies to look at a meta-analysis of terror management research from Burke, Kolsloff, and Landau 2013, to give us access to a bit of a broader picture here. Of the 31 studies that they assessed, 77% provided support for the hypothesis that mortality salience had a pronounced effect on political stances. Specifically, there was support for both the idea that mortality salience increases belief in existing worldviews and that mortality salience increases conservatism, also something called the conservative shift hypothesis. Worldview defense received greater support within the data than did the concept of the conservative shift, however. Overall, mortality salience explained 25% of the variance in political dogmatism and conservative shift as well. Finding a single variable with that kind of degree of influence is kind of exceedingly rare in the social sciences, exceeding the 95th percentile. The results of this meta indicate that while fear of death sometimes increases support for conservatism, it more frequently produces partisanship for one's existing worldview, and that can be a left-leaning worldview or a right-leaning worldview. In other words, being afraid does not inherently make people more conservative, but it does embolden existing political stances. And in 2020, with so much anti-Trump information for years that have occurred before the events of the election, I would suggest that means an anti-Trump sentiment has not only been encouraged due to the occurrences of this year, but may have been more prevalent as well. I mentioned that fear can cause liberals to become more partisan, just as with conservatives, and that's exactly what Nile et al. 2009 found across 3 studies. In their first experiment, participants' support for liberal or conservative issues were surveyed, and then some were exposed to information about an injustice, in this case the Enron scandal. Remember that, fellow boomers? They also read an essay purportedly written by a foreign exchange student that was either critical of the USA or supportive, and were asked how much they agreed with the piece. When not thinking about the Enron scandal, liberals almost entirely agreed with the anti-USA article, while conservatives disagreed. In contrast, when exposed to the information about the unjustness of Enron, both liberals and conservatives were more moderate in their nationalistic support of the United States. While not related to mortality salience directly, it's important to note not only the extreme differences between liberals and conservatives in their natural support for the United States, but also how, under some circumstances, evidence of malfeasance can somewhat balance the two groups in their nationalistic feelings. The second study, however, did look at the effects of mortality salience and political ideology. This time, participants' dedication to their self-identified political ideology was assessed by asking participants to what degree they believed in the right to abortion or the right to capital punishment, serving as representatives of a liberal and conservative political stance, respectively. They found that when primed to think about death, political dogmatism in terms of ideological conviction increased across the sample. That is, liberals were more supportive of abortion and the death penalty when they thought about death. To put it more succinctly, liberals expressed a seemingly contradictory form of opinions, being both pro-life and pro-death penalty when they thought about their own death. It is important to note that conviction was significantly lower among psychological liberals than it was among psychological conservatives, but also significantly different in liberals exposed to thoughts of death compared to the control. In other words, thought of death made liberals less convicted towards their beliefs and more self-contradictory than it did conservatives. And that's well summed up, I think, in the cries that Trump unfairly banned travel to China, but that he also bungled the handling of the coup by not doing enough. You can't have it both ways. It just seems, as the data indicate, that liberals are more likely to hold conflictory ideas. As a third study further illustrated, this time participants were asked to think about death, and then their opinions on whether or not married gay couples should receive health benefits from their partner's employer, as is often the case for married straight couples. Conservatives, and to a smaller degree liberals, were less supportive of gay marriage rights to spousal benefits when they had been primed to think about their inevitable demise. In short, liberals' levels of conviction to their political ideas, when afraid, were diminished. I should note that I have some issues with the methods in the study, namely in that conservatism was determined by support for George W. Bush and by increased military spending, which I think would not describe many self-identified conservatives today. It certainly doesn't describe myself. While liberalism was determined via support for the ACLU, unions, socialized medicine, and feminism. I'm not a liberal, so I can't say whether or not liberals would agree that those things typify their political stance today, but I felt it important to include this caveat because I really do try to tell you anytime I find something in a study that I find a bit odd. To make more sense of the changes in conviction and the increase in contradictory beliefs induced by death thoughts, particularly within liberals, we should see if moral beliefs are similarly affected by thoughts of death. Haidt and Graham's 2007 Moral Foundations theory posits that all people hold the same 5 moral virtues, but value them to greater or lesser degrees. The foundation of fairness deals with concerns about justice and equity in human affairs. Harm and care deals with concerns about looking out for the welfare of others, particularly the vulnerable. The third value, loyalty, deals with concerns about group allegiances. The authority foundation deals with concerns about maintaining established hierarchies and showing deference to one's superiors. And the fifth value, purity, deals with hygienic, social, and spiritual concerns about avoiding pollution and regulating bodily boundaries. Haidt and Graham found that conservatives value all of the foundations about equally, while liberals generally only highly value the foundations of harm and care and fairness, which are also sometimes called the individualizing values, while purity, authority, and loyalty are the binding values. This list has since been expanded to include the value of liberty, but it's a foundation that really only matters for typifying libertarians, and we're just going to be looking at the base 5 in a study here from Bassett et al. 2014. In the first study in this set, participants took the Moral Foundations test, identified their personal political orientation as conservative, liberal, or moderate, and were then asked to think either about their fear of death or their fears associated with public speaking. They found that when primed to think about death, liberals came to more strongly value the individualizing factors of harm or care and fairness, while simultaneously being less concerned with the binding moral foundations of purity, authority, and loyalty, while the opposite was the case for conservatives, who became more concerned with the binding moral foundations and less concerned with the individualizing ones. Breaking these individual categories down into individual values reveals some interesting results. The greatest single change in liberals when primed with thoughts of death was respect for authority. Liberals were more favorable towards subversion of authority figures when thinking about their own mortality. Well, that sure does describe 2020 well, doesn't it? Be it in the form of Black Lives Matter protests or in the complete lack of concern for voting irregularities. The second largest shift in liberals was an increased preoccupation with fairness. Be aware, fairness doesn't mean playing by the rules. It doesn't actually mean being fair. It means a concern with equity, again typifying the 2020 protests. The third largest change was in respect for loyalty, which decreased in liberals when fearful of death, followed by a decreased respect for purity, and finally, the smallest effect size was in an increase in concern for caring for the welfare of others. That's right, when thinking about death, the thing that liberals are least concerned about in terms of changes to their own beliefs or behavior is the welfare of others. On average, conservatives' moral foundations were far less affected by thoughts of death than were those of liberals, with one major exception. The average change in liberals' moral foundations was 36.2, while the average change in conservative foundations was 29.8. But the largest single shift in this set was conservatives' concern with purity, which again is a revulsion towards things that one might find disgusting, which massively increased when thinking about death in conservatives. Based on these data, we might expect conservatives to be the most worried about the COOF and mask mandates, but that often doesn't seem to be the case, which may be indicative that conservatives are just not afraid of the COOF to the point that it induces increased purity concerns. A second study replicated the first and isolated the unique effect of mortality salience upon liberals compared to conservatives. Specifically, when liberals and conservatives were primed to think about dental pain, liberals and conservatives valued individualizing factors of harm, care, and fairness about equally. However, when liberals thought about death, they were much more concerned with those factors, while conservatives were much less concerned with the individualizing moral foundations. Dental pain primes had similar patterns of effects in both liberals and conservatives, as did thoughts of death in relationship to the binding factors of moral foundations. That is, while liberals generally valued binding morals less than conservatives, they valued them to the least degree when primed with their own mortality. However, conservatives were also less concerned with these same binding factors when they were thinking of death. When conservatives are afraid, then, they tend to be less dogmatic towards their own core moral values, while liberals become more dogmatic under the exact same circumstances. There is some evidence that fear actually makes people more conservative, and while I mentioned it briefly before, this is known as the conservative shift hypothesis, and it's something we would expect to see in a year so riddled with high mortality salience. A meta-analysis from Jost et al. 2003 suggested that conservatism would increase during times of uncertainty, given that conservatism, via the definition that Jost et al. Utilize, is, quote, the disposition and tendency to preserve what is established, opposition to change. Thus, when things change, conservatism should increase. The extant research at the time illustrated that feeling the world is changing for the worse and perceptions of the world as a dangerous place were both positively related to conservatism. Additionally, fear-related words prompted faster responses in conservatives, and threatening messages were more influential in conservatives than they were in liberals in their response times. Moreover, fear of death and mortality salience were both consistently positively related to conservatism via Joss sample. Thus, it seems that when people are afraid, they may tend to be more conservative, and that would explain the record turnouts for Trump. But what about the record turnouts for Biden? Bonanno and Joss 2006 tested the conservative shift hypothesis by assessing witness responses to the events of 9/11 over a period of time. The reason the sample sizes here are so small is because the 45 participants in this study were near the towers during the event, with 11 having been inside one of the buildings when the first plane struck. Yeah, these are people who experienced some immeasurably intense mortality salience. Following the attack up until the time of final data collection, 3 times as many participants reported becoming more conservative than reported becoming more liberal. And of those that did report a liberal shift, all of them were already self-reported Democrats. Not a single conservative nor independent felt that he or she had grown more liberal in the mortality salient environment of post-9/11 America. Libertarians and Green Party supporters were unaffected, but to be fair, there weren't enough of them to make any sort of inference. I know, I feel that pain.
Government is bad, business is good, free market.
In toto, 17 participants reported becoming more conservative compared to 28 who remained unchanged, or who became more liberal. While perceived danger was related to persistent conservative shift, the effect of visceral sight of death or injury on the scene, while it induced a temporary increase in conservatism, dissipated after 18 months. In other words, these effects are often impermanent. This type of political coping mechanism is also likely just that, a coping mechanism, as they found that increased conservatism over this time was also related to increased PTSD diagnoses and depressive symptoms. While PTSD symptoms remained related to increased conservatism over time, depressive symptoms subsided after 18 months. Related to conservatism, witnesses also expressed increased patriotism, support for the military, and support for religiosity. Friends who were asked about how well these participants had coped with the experience said that those who had remained the most conservative after 18 months were also those most severely influenced. This well-cited study is often used as evidence of the conservative shift, but I think it's important to note just how extreme and specific of a sample that this really was. These were people who experienced one of the most harrowing single events in modern United States history. It's likely that they're not a very representative sample, but I did feel it necessary to show you where the kind of data that form the backbone of the conservative shift hypothesis arises. While this extreme example shows perhaps some evidence of the conservative shift, it is possible that what fear actually induces is an authoritarian shift, regardless of its political valence. Research from Prusova and Gulevich, 2019, provides some important context from Russia. Russian university students were questioned about their support for various political ideas. A week later, they watched a short film about a attack in Russia, a film about dental work, or a film about the automobile industry, and were then asked to imagine what it might be like to experience a terror attack, dental pain, or working with cars, representing mortality salience, fear salience, and control groups respectively. Afterwards, their feelings about freedom were questioned, and they were again asked about their political stances. When a participant's mortality was salient, the researchers noted a shift towards support for greater government control over the economy, social organizations, and science compared to the control. Those who had thought about a deadly event also expressed an increased desire for control over media, political parties, and the education system. The authors describe this as a control shift, and it seemingly reflects the draconian policies instituted in many states where the rich flaunt their ability to not need to play by the rules as business owners and people at large struggle.
I'm losing everything. Everything I own is being taken away from me. And they set up a movie company right next to my outdoor patio, which is right over here.
All while Biden has proposed more lockdowns. Fear seems to create a control shift, not a shift unique to conservatives, but unique to authoritarians. And the arguments over the election are perhaps the ultimate symbol of the struggle for control over who gets to be the leader of the free world.
Your shenanigans could cost me this election.
Well, come on, Deb. No Irishman can stop you from getting to be dog killer this time. You're unnatural.
While there is some evidence of the conservative shift, there is also evidence of a liberal shift in the face of mortality salience, and we'll see more about that as we go forward. But perhaps it's really neither one of these. It's a control shift, a desire in people to make sense of the world which is in turmoil through authoritarian practices. But has this happened in reality, or is this all just theory? To further understand how terror management theory influences voting behavior, let's look specifically at the effects of mortality salience on individual presidential and local elections.
Sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted sorrow.
The extent to which one supports a politician specifically is potentially influenced by thoughts of death, just as are political orientations, beliefs, and morality. And an aspect of support for a politician often lies in that politician's charisma. The first ever televised presidential debate between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon in 1960 is perhaps one of the most well-studied single events in political communication research, because it illustrated the incredible influence of peripheral route cues. That is, things like appearance over the meaning behind a message.
That is the danger of being super handsome. When you're in the bubble, nobody ever tells you the truth. For years, I thought I spoke excellent French. Bazar confond j'entends-tu.
About 80% of American families owned a television, and many gathered around to watch the historic event, witnessing a charismatic and cool Kennedy and a sickly-looking Nixon sweating profusely under the hot studio lights. A study from Druckmann, oh god, no, not that one, 2003, now somewhat famously exposed some participants to the classic debate, many decades after the fact, either just as audio or with a visual component. He found that television viewers relied both on their perceptions of leadership effectiveness and integrity when evaluating the two candidates, while audio listeners relied only on their perceptions of leadership effectiveness. Perceived integrity played a significantly more important role for viewers than it did for listeners, and that perception strongly favored Kennedy, viewing him as having more integrity. Moreover, this resulted in more participants believing that Kennedy had won the debate. All of this, given that it was conducted 40 years after the fact, was mostly unrelated to individual political orientations. The point is, perception matters in political candidate preference. A doctoral thesis from O'Brien 2020 revisited this debate and specifically isolated perceptions of candidate charisma, replicating the Druckmann experiment, but this time also giving participants a written version of the debate. While Kennedy was generally viewed as much more charismatic, Nixon was seen as nearly half as charismatic when participants watched the debate rather than listened to it. Similarly, listeners thought Nixon was more competent than Kennedy, but that Kennedy was far more competent when they watched the debate. If people believed that Kennedy was leagues more charismatic than Nixon, particularly when they watched him talk, and subsequently were considerably more likely to believe that he won the debate, then charisma clearly matters for political candidates. Kosloff et al. 2010 examined the effects of charisma on preference for a political candidate specifically when people were thinking about death. Participants' political orientations were self-identified. Some were asked to think about death and others about pain. They then read and evaluated political statements by two hypothetical gubernatorial candidates, imagining them as candidates in an upcoming state election in their own state. One expressed liberal values, the other conservative values, and charisma was manipulated, with the charismatic candidate expressing optimism, bold expectations, and a positive view of voters. In contrast, the uncharismatic candidate's speech was categorized by modest aspirations, statements about the candidate's own limitations, and he spoke humbly. Liberals and conservatives both favored a candidate that espoused beliefs in line with their own political attitudes, as we would expect. However, there was an interesting effect of mortality salience. That is, death increased partisanship in terms of charismatic perceptions. There were some small differences as well, specifically in that liberals always found conservative candidates to be less charismatic than conservatives found liberal candidates. The point is that both conservatives and liberals find politicians that they agree with to be more charismatic, and politicians that they disagree with to be less charismatic, particularly when they are worrying about their own potential demise, further providing some evidence for why 2020 was such a highly partisan year with unprecedented voter turnout. Speaking of 2020, has mortality salience affected Trump's perceived charisma? Williams et al. 2017 looked at perceptions of Trump's narcissism and charisma, his congruence with the values of the voter, the potential for an impending crisis, and ultimately, how these factors affected voter choice, polling participants both before and after the 2016 presidential election. Viewing the United States as a nation in crisis was associated with perceived narcissism of Hillary Clinton and negatively associated with attributed charisma to her, value congruence, and voter choice, all for Clinton. That is, people whose mortality was perhaps more salient, viewing the country as in crisis, saw Clinton as more narcissistic and, as a function of that perceived narcissism, as less charismatic, less attitudinally agreeable, and were subsequently less likely to say they would vote for her. The opposite was the case for Trump, in that crisis perceptions were not associated with perceived leader narcissism for Trump to the same degree, and were instead positively associated with his charisma, value congruence, and voter choice, comparatively to Clinton. Interestingly, political involvement was associated with a greater perception of Trump's narcissism and subsequently negatively attributed to his charisma, value congruence, and produced increased voter preference for Clinton. That is, positive perceptions of Trump's charisma seem based in part due to perceptions of his narcissism compared to Clinton. And if the media has done nothing over the last few years, they certainly emphasized his narcissism. Really, it's astonishing that a man who even back in 2016 could hardly keep the word best out of his mouth to describe himself and his campaign and the country wasn't seen as narcissistic enough to damage his charisma. But perhaps that's more telling of just how narcissistic people found Clinton to be in contrast. When people did find Clinton to be charismatic, however, they were vastly more likely to vote for her, just as people who found Trump to be charismatic were far more likely to vote for him. It's important to keep in mind, though, that these results were found specifically when under the threat of crisis, when mortality was salient. Now, Trump has been blamed by countless news sources and pundits for a natural disaster repeatedly over the last year, as well as the BLM civil unrest, emerging exclusively from the left, and has been blamed directly or indirectly for 4 years for pretty much everything and anything. It's almost like people didn't get that thanks Obama was a joke and applied it unquestionably to Trump. Did you stub your toe this morning? Frickin' drumpf. My point is, if Trump was seen as a less narcissistic leader and is more charismatic, and therefore garnered more votes when people were afraid of a crisis impending in 2016, if people are now associating a crisis with Trump, well, it's very likely that that situation has changed. And were this same study to be replicated in the Trump-Biden race, I suppose as incomprehensible as it may sound, crisis could influence people to see Trump as less charismatic than Joe Biden. Go ahead and test it, Williams and colleagues. I'd be real interested in the results because the hypothesis is mind-boggling to me.
Is to lower the rhetoric based on division. Stop appealing.
But not outside the realm of possibility. I suppose if people thought Hillary was the bigger narcissist compared to Trump in 2016, and I mean, I voted for the guy twice and humble is not a word I would use to describe him, bigly, then who knows what the results would be in 2020. But again, this may also just be a function of crisis, of fear. When one is thinking about death, whether or not that person will cling to a political group, a politician, or nationality is dependent in part to the degree of their own identification with that group, as seen in Landau et al. 2004. In the first study in this series, participants were asked to think about their own death, or think about watching television, and then read a positive report about George Bush's response to the 9/11 attacks and subsequent war in Iraq, and were then asked to what degree they felt safe, knowing that Bush was doing everything possible to guard the United States against further attacks. Subjects who thought about death expressed greater support for Bush's actions than the control group. When a politician says they're going to make all the scary things go away, like the coup, and the riots, and the culture war, well, it makes sense why people might be supportive of that politician. And that's pretty much precisely what the Biden campaign platform was. Not that he necessarily stands for anything in particular other than not being Trump, and that he'll make all the things that scared people under Trump disappear. In an additional experiment, participants were asked to think either about death, about an exam, or about the events of 9/11, and then read a positive report praising George W. Bush. Similarly to before, people who thought about their own death or about the 9/11 attack were much more supportive of Bush than those who thought about taking an exam. This was true regardless of one's own political orientation. When liberals thought about death, they were much more supportive of Bush, just as when they thought about 9/11. And they were about as supportive of him as were conservatives. A final study in this set compared opinions towards Bush to opinions towards John Kerry, after participants had been primed with thoughts of pain or thoughts of death, and found similar results in that when mortality was salient, people were far more likely to say that they would vote for Bush in the 2004 presidential election rather than Kerry. In contrast, support for Kerry was significantly higher than support for Bush when participants thought about pain rather than death. This effect occurred regardless of political orientation, meaning that people preferred Bush over Kerry whether or not they were Democrats or Republicans. As a Democrat strategist wrote in Time magazine in 2004, quote, "No matter how bad Bush does on the war and 9/11, just having voters think about it kills us." And I think much of the same accounts for the support for Biden, for voter outcome indicates that he received far more votes than Obama did in 2008. And that doesn't seem to have been a result of a great outpouring of love for Biden, but a result of fear of the virus, civil unrest, the woke culture war, all of which has been inflamed under Trump. Just having voters think about those things kills Trump. Nearly identical results were found in research from Cohen et al. 2005, who also looked at support for John Kerry or George W. Bush after participants were asked to think about death. This time, rather than think about pain or death, registered voters in the control thought about watching TV or about their own mortality, and were asked who they would vote for in the upcoming election, be it Bush or Kerry, undecided, or independent Ralph Nader. And woo lad, check out this image he posted on his official 2004 election page. How did Nader not have a Jeb tier sweep with this kind of marketing? Anyway, the results of this study were telling. When participants were primed to think about death, 32 said that they would cast their vote for the W, while when asked to think about watching TV, 34 said they would vote for John Kerry. Thoughts of death seemingly single-handedly swung the vote for Bush away from Kerry. This shift seems to have been based on thoughts of mortality alone. There was no major change for Nader, which again, considering this image, is inconceivable, but interestingly, when participants thought about watching TV, only 15 were undecided in who to vote for, while 23 were undecided when reminded about death. Fear of death does create uncertainty, and in response to that uncertainty, one may seek out a politician that he or she believes will be able to ameliorate the sense of uncertainty. But it doesn't necessarily create greater voting behavior. It often produces a lot of undecided voters. Specifically though, control participants reported that they would be voting for Kerry by a 4-to-1 margin compared to participants primed to think about death, who said that they intended to vote for Bush by a 2.5-to-1 margin. The implications of this study are clear, in that the 2004 presidential election was influenced by non-conscious concerns about death, as evidenced by the fact that registered voters reported intending to vote for Kerry by a huge margin in psychologically benign conditions, but by nearly the same huge margin for Bush only after the mortality salience induction. What the left, now asking for the right to heal, is often concerned with, based on the research of Haidt's moral foundations theory, are typically perceptions of justness and fairness, as well as avoiding harming others. As such, we would expect a candidate that is depicted as the more caring, kind option will not only be preferred by the left, but perhaps by people at large, particularly when those same people are afraid of death or the harmful potentialities that disease or rioting may produce. Research from Vial et al. 2009 illustrated this tendency in voter responses to the 2008 presidential election. First, participants in this study were asked to think either about death or about a time when he or she was uncertain, and were then exposed to quotes that emphasized either compassion or neutral concepts, and finally asked to assess their favorability towards then presidential candidates Obama and John McCain. When participants were asked to think about a time when they were uncertain, compassion had no effect on their preference for Obama or for McCain. In contrast, when participants were asked to think about death or mortality, and then also exposed to messages about compassion, they vastly favored Obama over McCain. What this means in light of the 2020 election is that when one candidate is framed as being the compassionate one and the other as harsh or cruel, only when in the context of thinking about mortality, as we know 2020 has induced, then the compassionate candidate is preferred. In the 2008 election, Obama, seen as the more compassionate candidate, was preferred over the less compassionate candidate McCain only when participants were thinking about their own mortality. The 2012 election was seemingly a little bit different, of which a study from Sterling Jost and Shroud 2016 was indicative. Given that we've seen that both charisma and the conservative shift hypothesis may influence how mortality salience affects voting behavior, the authors sought to further understand these relationships in context of the presidential race between then-incumbent Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, while taking into consideration systems justification theory, or SJT. SJT posits that individuals are motivated to perceive existing social, economic, and political arrangements as legitimate, fair, and just, and therefore explain to themselves that the good or bad things that happen to them happen for a just reason. People high in systems justification may justify that any seeming threat to the system is illegitimate. Conservatives, seeking to, by definition, conserve something about an existing societal system, are often higher in systems justification. Sterling and colleagues polled participants a month before the 2012 presidential election, asking them to think about death, and then questioning them about their political orientation, their ratings of Obama and Romney's charisma, their degree of systems justification, support for the two candidates, and their voting intentions. All respondents, regardless of their politics or preferred candidate, found Obama to be more charismatic, which we know alone can increase voting behavior and support, particularly when during a crisis. Interestingly, mortality salience had no effect on support for either candidate in this study. In fact, the opposite was the case, as mortality salience actually weakened the relationship between political ideology and candidate support by 0.08, which, although non-significant, is still quite contrary to what we would expect. Systems justification, again something usually related to conservatism, was also a bust, as participants who were low system justifiers only slightly preferred Obama over Romney, and even then, they preferred him more in the control condition than in the mortality salient condition. Interestingly, low system justifiers who tended to be more liberal were less supportive of Obama when their mortality was salient, providing some evidence for a conservative shift among liberals. However, this effect was not found in all of the 4 samples tested in this study, making it a bit sus in its reliability. Conservatives and liberals both found Obama to be more charismatic, but mortality salience had no effect on perceptions of candidate charisma, nor on the bolstering effect that charisma has on voting intentions. Conservatives who saw Obama as charismatic were more likely to vote for him, and once again, mortality salience had no influence on these intentions. So yeah, this study seemed to find no real evidence for either a conservative nor a liberal shift. So why do I bring it up? Because in 2012, while the US was involved in its typical warmongering business as usual, I would suggest the lack of findings in this study are due to the American populace just not having the same general levels of dread that were present in 2001 or 2004. These seemingly pointless data that found nothing are perhaps the most illuminating of all. This study is illustrative that the effects of mortality salience on voting behavior and political candidate preference cannot be so easily influenced by just asking participants to think about death. No, it instead requires a total environment of fear need be cultivated for the partisan effects of mortality salience to be made manifest. So if 2012 didn't see the same fear manipulations on voting behavior as it did in 2004, did it in 2016, and in 2020? Well, worry not, because we have some more data to illustrate the effect of mortality salience on Trump's presidency. Cohen, Solomon, and Kaplan 2017 expected that many voters may have been encouraged to vote for Trump in the wake of the 2015 Islamic attacks in Paris, France, and San Bernardino, California. Participants were asked to think either about death or about dental pain, and then were asked how favorably they viewed Donald Trump, to what extent they admired him, and to what extent they felt confident in him as a leader, and whether or not they intended to vote for him in 2016. Those who were primed to think about death were more than twice as supportive of Trump than those primed to think about pain. They found that this effect occurred regardless of political orientation, in that mortality salience forwarded increased support for Trump from people across the political spectrum. They also accounted for potential influences that fear might have, in that people thinking about death may be more afraid and therefore make irrational decisions, but found that general fear did not increase as support for Trump increased. In a second study, participants were once again primed with thoughts of death or about thoughts of pain. This time, the questions previously asked to gauge favorability towards Trump were also asked to gauge favorability towards Hillary Clinton. And an interesting interaction appeared. While both Trump and Clinton saw increased support when participants thought about death, support for Clinton was nearly double that for Trump when participants thought about pain.
Please hurt me, mommy. Is it really what you want?
A third study further solidified fear of immigration as being similar, at least in 2016, as was fear of death. Participants were asked to think about death, pain, or about immigrants moving to their neighborhood, and found that respondents had similar levels of death thought accessibility comparatively to those who thought about pain when they thought about death or about immigration. That is, thoughts of immigration precisely in a period of time when fear of Islamic terrorism was high had very similar results to the effect of death primes, and when it concerns Trump's 2016 victory versus the 2020 election, this makes a lot of sense, but let me explain. In 2015, there were 107 terror attacks linked to Islamic extremists worldwide, and I'm taking that number from Wikipedia before you fact-check me, Susan, including the San Bernardino attack, which killed 14 people and injured 22 more, and occurred less than a week before the presidential election. This likely means that thoughts of violence were salient in the minds of many voters, and that may have encouraged people to vote for Trump, more people than may have had they not heard about these events so soon before the election. Why didn't Trump get the same bump then in 2020, you ask? Well, considering that the last major terrorist attack in the United States linked to Islamic extremism was the 2017 Lower Manhattan truck attack, it's been years since many Americans have likely thought about the possibility for domestic terror, and that might be why that particular element of mortality salience that worked in Trump's favor in 2016, purportedly, was less potent in 2020. Additionally, worldwide, there have been 6 terror attacks in 2020 compared to 2015, which saw over 16 times the number of total global terrorist incidences. Understanding more about exactly who was afraid of Islamic terrorism might help us understand why Trump may have received support in 2016. And to find out more, we can look at Hanner et al. 2019, who assessed the relationships between various socio-political variables, fear of terrorism, and support for anti-Muslim policies. They found that, within their sample, fear of terrorist attacks generated the second greatest amount of fear. Economic collapse and natural disasters ranked third and fourth, while in contrast, civil unrest created the most amount of fear in participants, something to keep in mind. Additionally, having a personal health crisis was the single issue that most worried subjects in this sample. Another thing to keep in mind, they found that women were more afraid and were more worried about terrorism than were men. Christians and conservatives were also more concerned with terrorism than were non-Christians and were liberals. In contrast, despite their increased fear, women were actually less likely to support anti-Muslim policies, indicating behavior that runs contrary to assuaging fears. Conservatism and Christian religiosity were both related to increased support for anti-Muslim political suggestions. Being white was unrelated to these policies, but education and working full-time were both negatively related to anti-Muslim legislation. In total, though, the single strongest factor in support for these policies was fear of terrorism. Further, support for anti-Muslim political action was negatively related to news interest, meaning people who are less politically knowledgeable were less supportive of these policies. It makes sense then that in the wake of terrorist attacks, that conservative support for Trump increased, while when fear was less salient, it decreased. But there are also a lot of quite telling findings in this study that apply to 2020 as well. Namely that the things that people were most afraid of were not terrorism, but civil unrest and personal health issues. Well, what two concerns have dominated the political landscape of 2020 if not those two exact issues? Perhaps conservatives felt more secure from fears that predominantly affected them in 2016, as terror attacks have subsided, while others felt more afraid concerning the issues of personal health and civil unrest, and thus felt that voting for Biden would be the best way to reduce those fears. This is not a grand conspiracy theory, it's just an explanation as to why it's possible that Biden really could have been the most popular candidate by sheer number in the entire history of the United States.
we have put together, I think, the most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in the history of American politics.
Not support for Biden, but fear. Fear of the things that scare Americans the most, according to these data: personal health crises and civil unrest. I bring all of this background information up because fear of small reminders of mortality have had effects much more recently in regards to the coup, as evidenced from Sue and Shen 2020. Drawing from a CNN phone sample that asked respondents about fears surrounding the coup and their personal beliefs, they found that conservatives' political ideologies were largely unaffected by fear of the coup, while in contrast, non-conservatives became more liberal as the degree of COVID-19 threat increased. Left-leaning people moved further left in this fear-inducing environment. Left-leaning participants' degree of partisanship was also exacerbated by their level of education. That is, the more highly educated liberals and left-leaning people moved even further left during this period of data collection. Moreover, being conservative was positively related to support for a travel ban, such that as conservatism increased, so did support for the ban. Thus, even though the ban would reduce the spread of the disease logically, because fear moved left-leaning people so much further left, they likely were more concerned with potential human rights violations than by eliminating the source of their fear in a very roundabout manner. Specifically, a 1-unit increase in the perceived degree of COVID-19 threat via its effect on bolstering non-conservatives' political ideology subsequently reduced their support for international travel bans by 0.006. That's very minor, but what it means is that the more afraid left-leaning people were about COVID-19, the further left their political ideology became and the less supportive they were of nationalism in the form of a travel ban. And that right there is the liberal shift. Thus, fear of all types, but specifically fear of the coup, is one of the things that exacerbates political partisanship, and it seems that the coup only did so for non-conservatives. Thus, the time leading up to the 2020 presidential election was one of possibly much stronger support for the left than average, just due to fear of COVID. This is evidence again against the proposed conservative shift, and instead of an authoritarian control shift that occurs when people are afraid, and indicative of reasons for which researchers need stop labeling authoritarianism as an inherently right-wing trait. It's clearly not.
John Spartan, you are fined 1 credit for a violation of the verbal morality statute.
What the hell is that?
Although considering that there have been calls to impeach Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer after she announced to extend lockdowns in the state, or the backlash from self-described liberal progressive feminist author Naomi Wolf, a woman previously forced to pull her book from shelves due to glaring historical inaccuracies, expressing instant regret that her characteristically low-information Biden vote might mean more lockdowns, I would be interested to see where the relationship between the coup, moving people further left, and subsequent nationalism lies after the next round of lockdowns, and extended amounts of mortality salience. But I can't say for sure. And with that, that study brings us up to date with where we are today. So with all of this in mind, let's come to some conclusions. Whatever your opinions on the 2020 presidential election are, I think it's unquestionable that national voting behavior appeared to have been the highest in United States history. Surely part of that may be due to increased access to voting via mail-in ballots, but it may also be related to more complex psychological processes, namely those of mortality salience and terror management. Times of fear seem to exacerbate political tensions by encouraging harshness and stringency in political opinions. This can involve being more willing to harm someone who you see as a political opponent, or perhaps to do anything necessary to win. This often leads to people holding contradictory opinions when they are afraid, as some existing political stances are emboldened while others are abandoned, as an illogical response to terror. This has been measured not just in opinions, but in actual voting behavior, with fear perhaps being the key feature behind support for George W. Bush post 9/11, and perhaps for Trump in 2016, with the elections occurring just weeks after a major terror attack. Fear is perhaps one of the words that, again, best describes 2020, and as such, it's no surprise then to see political dogmatism, irrationality, and contradictory political opinions as well as massive political activism all at the same time. Because when people are afraid, they look to systems for help, and if they don't like the system they see, well, they'll use perhaps any means necessary to implement one that they do. That is the power of fear, which, while a product of evolution, is often wholly irrational. But hey, what do you guys think? Do you think 2020 was a uniquely scary year? And if so, did that fearful environment influence the beliefs and actions of American voters? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. While we've talked a lot about fear today, it is the Christmas season, a time of hope and not of hate, and I for one hope that at least for a while, you can squeeze just a little bit of joy out of this dumpster fire of a year. Perhaps by gathering around that fire and roasting some chestnuts or marshmallows over its smoldering corpse. Despite how terrifying this year has been for any number of reasons to so many of us, I wish you all the happiest of holidays and the merriest of New Year's and Christmases. I want to give an enormous thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar who have allowed me to keep doing this work, which is really an incredible privilege. You guys are all wonderful. If you want to support the channel, there are links in the description, both to Patreon and Subscribestar and to my merch store. Thank you all so much for watching this video. And as always, dear friends, Altana Volt,